Imagine standing in the heart of Rome. The year is somewhere in the late Republic and the Forum buzzes with energy. Senators move with grave faces, citizens cluster to hear proclamations, soldiers march with the weight of duty on their shoulders. In this city of marble and blood, loyalty is everything. Rome is not just a place. It is an empire built on trust between rulers and ruled, between generals and soldiers, between masters and slaves. Yet behind the polished speeches and triumphal arches, betrayal lurks like a disease. And when it is found, Rome responds with a darkness so cold and so deliberate that even centuries later, the stories still cause us to shiver. For the Romans, betrayal was not just a personal offense, it was a crime against the very foundation of the state. To betray Rome was to betray civilization itself, to challenge the gods who had supposedly chosen the city for greatness, and to weaken the eternal order. Unlike theft or even murder, treason was not something the state could forgive. And so punishment was designed not simply to kill the traitor, but to erase them, to humiliate them, and to turn their death into a spectacle of fear. When we talk about betrayal in Rome, we must first understand how they defined it. There was preditio, which meant handing over a city, an army, or a secret to the enemy. There was perduellio, the ancient word for high treason, usually aimed at those who raised arms against Rome itself. And there was betrayal on a more personal level, like a slave turning against his master or a soldier deserting his legion. In every case, the punishment reflected the Romans' obsession with loyalty and discipline. Let us begin at the beginning, the early Republic, a time when Rome was still growing from a city-state into a regional power. Punishments then were primitive but symbolic. A man accused of treason could be stripped naked, beaten with rods, and executed in the Forum, his body left on display as a warning. Some were hurled from the Tarpeian Rock, a steep cliff on the Capitoline Hill. To be thrown from that height was not only a death sentence but a public humiliation. The traitor was cast out of the city's sacred heart, flung into the void as if rejected by the gods themselves. But as Rome grew stronger, so too did its punishments. The Republic and later the Empire made an art of cruelty, shaping each execution to carry a message. If you betrayed Rome, your death had to be remembered. Consider the senators and generals who dared to conspire against the Republic. Political betrayal was the most dangerous of all, because it threatened to tear Rome apart from within. The conspiracy of Catiline in 63 BCE is one of the most famous examples. Catiline was a patrician, a man of high birth who gathered a group of desperate followers and plotted to overthrow the government. When his plan was exposed by Cicero, the Senate debated what should be done. There was no trial in the usual sense. 5 of Catiline's accomplices were strangled in the Tullianum prison, an underground chamber so foul that Roman historians described it as reeking of death. The act was quick, secret, and absolute. No bodies were returned to their families. No burial rites were given. To betray the Republic was to lose not only life but honor, memory, and place in the afterlife. This punishment was not unique. Again and again, those who betrayed the Senate or the Emperor were executed in ways that denied them dignity. Some were beheaded in public, their severed heads displayed on the rostra, the great speaker's platform in the Forum. Others were dragged through the streets, their bodies mutilated by angry crowds. And sometimes the punishment extended beyond the traitor himself. Families could be stripped of property, titles erased, names struck from public records. Rome did not just kill traitors, it sought to annihilate them completely. But what about ordinary citizens? The poor man accused of plotting with Rome's enemies or the slave suspected of turning against his master. Here the punishments grew darker still. Crucifixion, the most infamous Roman execution method, was often reserved for rebels, deserters, and slaves guilty of betrayal. To be crucified was to suffer slowly and publicly. Victims could hang for hours, sometimes days, in unimaginable pain, exposed to sun, wind, and the mockery of crowds. The Romans chose crucifixion not only because it was cruel, but because it was visible. Every passerby was reminded of the fate that awaited those who betrayed their place in society. Slaves, in particular, bore the harshest weight of Rome's paranoia. The law declared that if a master was murdered in his own house, all the slaves under that roof could be executed, whether guilty or not. Why? because their loyalty was expected to be absolute. To fail in protecting a master was considered complicity. One chilling example comes from 61 CE during the reign of Nero, when a senator named Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his slaves. The Senate decreed that all 400 slaves of his household must be put to death. Despite public protests, the mass execution went forward, a brutal reminder that in Rome, suspicion of betrayal was enough to justify rivers of blood. Yet betrayal was not always punished by death alone. Sometimes the Romans used exile, a quieter but equally devastating sentence. For an elite Roman, exile meant banishment from the city, separation from family, confiscation of wealth, and the erasure of one's public life. It was a living death, a slow punishment that gnawed at pride and honor. The traitor would wander foreign lands, shamed and forgotten, while Rome thrived without him. Still, the most unforgettable punishments were those designed to shock the public. In the later Republic, political rivals accused of treason were sometimes paraded in chains before being executed. Soldiers who deserted in battle could face decimation, a punishment in which every 10th man in a unit was chosen by lot and killed by his comrades. This not only punished betrayal, but also forced the survivors to carry guilt and fear into every battle afterward. The message was clear. Rome valued loyalty above life itself. As we follow this dark trail, we see how Rome turned punishment into theater. The Colosseum, which most people imagine as a place of gladiatorial combat, was also a stage for executing criminals. Traitors and rebels could be subjected to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. They were stripped naked, tied up, and thrown into the arena where lions, bears, or leopards tore them apart while tens of thousands of spectators roared. This was justice's spectacle. Cruelty transformed into entertainment, betrayal punished with blood and horror on a scale meant to echo across the empire. From the Tarpeian Rock to the Colosseum, from strangulation in the Tullianum to crucifixion on the roadside, Roman punishments for betrayal were never random. They were carefully chosen to erase trust in the traitor, to destroy their body and memory, and to remind every citizen, soldier, and slave that loyalty was the lifeblood of the empire. And this is only the beginning, because as we move deeper into Rome's history, the punishments grow even more elaborate. Senators forced to slit their own throats, generals executed by their soldiers, entire cities wiped out as examples. Treachery was not just an act against Rome, it was a curse that demanded blood. In the next part, we step into the lives of Rome's elites, the senators, generals, and emperors themselves, and see what happened when betrayal spread among the powerful. Their punishments were sometimes less about public spectacle and more about politics, secrecy, and the silent terror of a blade in the night. Rome did not forgive betrayal at any level, and those who played games with power soon discovered how dark and final Roman justice could be. The deeper we travel into Roman history, the clearer it becomes that betrayal was not confined to slaves, soldiers, or nameless criminals. Treachery seeped into the very heart of Rome's ruling class. Senators, generals, and even emperors themselves stood on ground that could collapse beneath them at any moment. Power in Rome was intoxicating, but it was also fragile. To rise too quickly was to invite envy, and to be suspected of treason was often as deadly as committing it. In this world of shifting alliances and whispered conspiracies, punishment for betrayal became not only a matter of law, but also a weapon of politics. For the senators of Rome, treason was a constant shadow. The Senate was both the guardian of the Republic and later the servant of emperors, and in both roles it was filled with rivals. Accusations of treason, or maestas as it came to be known, could be hurled as easily as insults. To plot against the Republic, to conspire against an emperor, or even to speak carelessly in the wrong company could bring the charge of betrayal. Once accused, the outcome was rarely in doubt. Senators condemned for treason often faced forced suicide. Rome had a strange relationship with dignity and death, and the elite were sometimes given the chance to take their own lives rather than be publicly executed. To the Romans, this preserved a shred of honor, and for the emperor it spared the spectacle of killing a fellow nobleman in open disgrace. Yet make no mistake, this was no mercy. The senator was given a blade, and the expectation was clear. He must cut his own veins in a bath, or plunge the dagger into his chest, all while witnesses ensured the deed was carried out. Families sometimes begged for leniency, but property was usually confiscated, and the family name stained forever. One of the most chilling examples is found in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who ruled after Augustus. Tiberius was a suspicious man, haunted by conspiracies both real and imagined. Under his rule, the law of majestas became a weapon. Senators accused of plotting against him were dragged into trials where witnesses were bribed, evidence manufactured, and verdicts predetermined. Those found guilty were given the choice of suicide, while their estates were seized by the state. The Senate chamber, once a place of debate, became a theater of fear, where every man looked over his shoulder, wondering which whispered word might be his undoing. Generals were not immune either. In fact, they were perhaps the most dangerous of all potential traitors. Rome's armies were vast, disciplined, and loyal, but loyalty was not always to the Senate or emperor. Often, soldiers pledged their devotion to the general who led them into battle. A successful general returning from campaign could command more love from his legion than the ruler in Rome. And so, every general carried within him the seed of potential treason. Take the story of Germanicus, the adopted son of Tiberius. Germanicus was wildly popular, beloved by his troops and adored by the people. He won victories in Germania and seemed destined for greatness. Yet his fame became a threat to Tiberius, and whispers of treason followed him. When Germanicus suddenly died in the east, rumors swirled that he had been poisoned on the emperor's orders. True or not, the lesson was clear. A general who shone too brightly risked being branded a traitor, and Rome's punishments could be subtle, silent, and impossible to escape. Other generals met their fate more openly. Corbulo, a celebrated commander under Nero, was accused of plotting rebellion after years of loyal service. Summoned to the emperor, he was ordered to take his own life. With grim composure, Corbulo fell on his sword, reportedly exclaiming, "Axios, I am worthy." Even in death, the expectation was that a Roman must show discipline, and that the punishment for betrayal, real or imagined, must reinforce the order of the state. When we speak of betrayal among Rome's elite, we cannot ignore the emperors themselves. To be emperor was to sit on a throne built of daggers. Nearly every ruler of the empire faced betrayal at some point, whether from senators, soldiers, or even family members, and many emperors responded with punishments so brutal they became infamous. Consider Caligula, whose paranoia grew as his reign descended into madness. He accused senators of treason at the slightest provocation, confiscating their estates, executing them without trial, and in some cases forcing their families to watch as they were tortured. For Caligula, punishment was not only justice, it was performance, a demonstration of his absolute power. His cruelty ensured loyalty through terror, but it also bred the very conspiracies he feared. Eventually, he was betrayed by his own Praetorian guard and murdered in a palace corridor, a victim of the same treachery he had punished so savagely in others. Nero followed a similar path. He executed his mother Agrippina, accusing her of plotting against him, though her only true crime may have been wielding too much influence. He ordered the deaths of senators, poets, and generals who stood in his way, branding them as traitors to the empire. One of the darkest moments of his reign came after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Faced with accusations that he had started the fire himself, Nero sought scapegoats. He turned on the Christians, a small and vulnerable group at the time, accusing them of betraying Rome with their strange beliefs. Their punishments were horrific: crucifixion, burning alive as human torches, and being torn apart by wild animals in the arena. Here, we see how the charge of betrayal could be twisted to serve political needs, punishing not only individuals but entire communities. The Senate itself often played a dangerous game. Under emperors like Domitian, senators who fell out of favor could be accused of conspiracy, their death staged as lawful punishment. Yet when an emperor grew too tyrannical, The Senate sometimes turned the tables. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, all fell not in battle, but to betrayal within their own palaces. For these emperors, the final punishment came not from the state, but from daggers in the dark. And yet, even in their deaths, the cycle of fear and retribution continued, as their killers justified assassination, as the removal of traitors to Rome itself. One of the most symbolic punishments for betrayal among the elite was the practice of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was not merely execution, but erasure. The traitor's name was struck from inscriptions, statues were smashed or recarved, portraits destroyed, and official records rewritten to pretend they had never existed. For Romans, who valued honor and legacy above almost everything, this was a fate worse than death. To be forgotten, to be erased from history, was the ultimate punishment for betrayal. Think of Emperor Geta, who was murdered by his brother Caracalla in 211 CE. After Geta's death, Caracalla ordered damnatio memoriae against him. Statues of Geta were destroyed, his name scratched from monuments, his memory obliterated as though he had never been. Betrayal in Rome was not only punished in flesh and blood, but in the very fabric of history. What strikes us most as we explore these stories is how betrayal among Rome's powerful was as much about perception as reality. A senator might not have truly plotted rebellion, but suspicion was enough. A general might not have intended treason, but his popularity made him dangerous. An emperor might not have deserved death, but his cruelty ensured that betrayal would come for him sooner or later. In every case, the punishment was designed to protect the stability of the state, or at least the stability of whoever held power at that moment. In the end, what Romans did to traitors among the elite reveals a society locked in constant tension between ambition and fear. Punishment was both sword and shield, cutting down rivals while guarding the throne. And yet, no matter how many senators were forced to open their veins, no matter how many generals were executed, betrayal remained a permanent shadow over Rome. As we move deeper, we leave the halls of power and step into the lives of the common people, slaves, rebels, and prisoners of war. Their betrayals were punished with cruelties even more savage. For the lower one's station, the less mercy Rome had to offer. And there, in the dust of the arenas and the silence of the crosses lining the roads, the empire's darkest punishments reached their peak. If treason haunted Rome's elite like a shadow, it consumed the lower classes like a raging fire. For slaves, commoners, rebels, and prisoners of war, betrayal was not a matter of political intrigue or whispered conspiracy. It was survival. And yet for Rome, survival was no excuse. To betray your master, your legion, or the empire itself was to break the very order of the world. Unlike senators who might be allowed the dignity of suicide, or generals who could fall on their swords, the lower classes met punishments designed not only to kill, but to terrify. Rome wanted their suffering to be a spectacle, an unforgettable reminder of what awaited any who dared to challenge its authority. No group in Rome was treated with more suspicion than slaves. They were everywhere, in the kitchens, fields, mines, and even in the bedrooms of the elite. Their numbers far outstripped those of their masters, and this imbalance bred paranoia. A single act of betrayal by a slave was not punished as an individual crime, but as a threat to the entire system of slavery itself. One of the most chilling laws in Rome stated that if a slave killed or betrayed their master, every single slave in the household could be executed in retaliation. This law was no empty threat. In 61 CE, when a wealthy senator named Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves, the Senate decreed that all 400 of his household slaves should be put to death. Crowds protested. Many argued it was too cruel, that innocent men, women, and children should not suffer for one act. But the Senate stood firm, declaring that Rome's safety depended on fear. And so, 400 slaves were marched to execution, their deaths ensuring that no slave in Rome would ever forget the cost of betrayal. For slaves, the methods of punishment were often the most brutal Rome had to offer. Crucifixion was the ultimate fate, a punishment reserved for traitors, rebels, and those considered the lowest of the low. to hang on a cross for hours or days, exposed to the sun, birds, and jeering crowds was both death and humiliation. It was a warning written on the body itself. This is what happens to those who betray. Of all betrayals Rome feared, none struck deeper than a full-scale slave rebellion, and the most famous of these was led by a gladiator named Spartacus. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and a small band of gladiators broke free from their training school in Capua. Armed first with kitchen knives and then with stolen weapons, they grew into a vast army of escaped slaves, peasants, and deserters. For 2 years, they defeated Roman legions, humiliating the Republic with every victory. To Rome, this was not merely rebellion, it was treason on the grandest scale. When the rebellion was finally crushed in 71 BCE by Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome made sure the punishment was unforgettable. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading into Rome. For miles, crosses lined the roadside, each bearing the broken body of a traitor. Travelers entering or leaving the city could not escape the sight. It was not simply execution, it was theater, a demonstration that Rome's authority was absolute. The rebellion was over, but the memory of those crosses lingered, a permanent scar on the empire's conscience. For Roman soldiers, betrayal was an even graver sin. Discipline was the backbone of the legions, and without it, Rome's armies could not conquer or survive. To desert one's post, flee from battle, or turn against one's commander was the highest form of treason. The Romans had a terrifying punishment for soldiers who betrayed their comrades: decimation. When a unit was guilty of cowardice or mutiny, the legion would be divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and the unlucky soldier who drew the marked stone was executed, often beaten to death by his 9 comrades. The message was brutal but clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated, and loyalty was enforced not only by commanders but by the soldiers themselves. The horror of decimation was not just in the killing, but in the participation. To strike down a fellow soldier, perhaps a friend or brother, was to feel Rome's wrath in your own hands. The legion was scarred but purified, bound together by fear as much as by discipline. Yet not all punishments were collective. Desertion, especially in times of war, was treated as outright treason. A soldier caught abandoning his post might be scourged, branded, or crucified in front of his comrades. Betrayal in the ranks was not only a crime, it was poison, and Rome answered with iron. Rome's greatest fear was rebellion, not only from slaves but from conquered peoples. To betray Rome's rule, to rise against its governors or legions, was to invite a punishment designed to crush both body and spirit. The Jewish revolt of 66-70 CE offers one of the most harrowing examples. When rebels seized Jerusalem, Rome responded with overwhelming force. After the city fell in 70 CE, thousands of prisoners were executed. Many were crucified, their crosses filling the landscape until wood itself grew scarce. Others were forced into slavery or sent into the arena to die for public entertainment. The punishment was not only for those who fought but for the entire population, a collective reminder that betrayal of Rome meant annihilation. Crucifixion, in these cases, was not simply execution, but erasure. The rebels' bodies were left to rot in public, denied burial, their names forgotten. To the Romans, this was fitting. Traitors did not deserve the dignity of remembrance. For prisoners of war, betrayal was defined simply as resistance to Rome. To fight against the legions was to challenge Rome's destiny, and when captured, these enemies became tools of terror. Many were paraded in triumphs, chained and humiliated as they marched behind victorious generals. For some, the end came swiftly, strangled in the forum after the procession. For others, the punishment was more elaborate. They were thrown into the arena, forced to face wild beasts or armed gladiators while the crowds roared. Betrayal of Rome, in this sense, became entertainment, with punishment turned into spectacle for the masses. Perhaps the most infamous example is the fate of Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who united tribes against Julius Caesar. After his defeat at Alesia in 52 BCE, Vercingetorix was taken to Rome, paraded in Caesar's triumph, and then strangled in the Tullianum prison. For the Romans, his death was the final act of betrayal's punishment, humiliation, display, and erasure. What emerges from these stories is a pattern both terrifying and consistent. For slaves, betrayal meant crucifixion. For rebels, it meant annihilation. For deserters, it meant death at the hands of comrades. For prisoners of war, it meant humiliation and spectacle. Rome's punishments were never random. They were calculated to uphold order through fear. The logic was brutal but effective. By making examples of traitors, Rome reinforced the idea that the empire was eternal, unbreakable, and merciless to those who opposed it. Each crucifixion, each execution, each public display was a message written in blood and stone. Rome does not forgive. And yet, as cruel as these punishments were, they reveal something deeper about Rome's psychology. The empire was vast, stretching across continents, ruling over countless peoples. To maintain such a realm, Rome relied not only on laws and legions but on terror. Betrayal was the crack in the foundation, and Rome's answer was always the hammer. As we move forward, we must turn to one of the darkest aspects of Roman punishment, the transformation of executions into spectacle. For in the arenas and circuses of the empire, treason and betrayal were not just crimes. They became theater, where death itself was staged as entertainment for a bloodthirsty audience. If Rome had mastered the art of punishment in the streets, fields, and battlefronts, it was in the arenas where death became a spectacle and betrayal was turned into theater. The Colosseum, amphitheaters, and circuses across the empire were not simply places of entertainment. They were instruments of political control. Here, betrayal was not merely punished, it was performed. The Roman people craved blood as much as they craved bread, and the emperors knew it. Executions were staged with the same care as a play or a gladiatorial match, choreographed to satisfy both justice and entertainment. To betray Rome was to become a character in this grim theater, where your final act was designed to horrify, humiliate, and remind every spectator of Rome's unbreakable power. The arena as a court of terror, when traitors, rebels, or criminals were condemned to die. Their punishment often began not in private cells but in public expectation. Word spread quickly through the city when an execution was to be held, and crowds gathered in anticipation. These were not mere deaths but productions, where the condemned became actors in stories Rome told about itself. In many cases, executions were tied to mythological reenactments. A traitor might be cast in the role of Icarus, tied to wings before being hurled from a height. Another might be dressed as Orpheus, and mauled by wild beasts, his cries drowned by the cheers of the audience. To betray Rome was to become part of a ritual, where ancient stories of hubris and downfall were retold with human lives. For the spectators, these punishments reinforced the belief that betrayal was not only a crime against the state, but a violation of cosmic order. Rome's justice was divine theater, written in screams and blood. Damnatio ad bestias, the beast's justice. One of the most infamous forms of execution was damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to beasts. Traitors, rebels, and enemies of the empire were thrown into the arena unarmed, left to face lions, leopards, bears, or packs of dogs. The punishment was designed to strip away dignity. The condemned were no longer soldiers or citizens, but prey. For those accused of betrayal, this punishment carried a special symbolism. To be torn apart by beasts was to be reduced below the status of man, to be denied any semblance of Roman honor. The crowd did not merely watch. They judged, laughed, and roared, as though betrayal itself was being devoured before their eyes. Writers such as Seneca and Martial described these scenes in chilling detail. Some condemned men begged for a swift death, only to be mocked by the crowd. Others fought desperately with bare hands or makeshift weapons, prolonging the spectacle as the beasts circled and tore them apart. The cruelty was deliberate. The more the traitor suffered, the stronger Rome appeared. The burning stage. Not all traitors were given to the beasts. Some were burned alive, their bodies turned into torches that illuminated the night. Nero, infamous for both cruelty and theatricality, staged such punishments in his private gardens. Prisoners and those accused of treachery were coated in pitch, fastened to posts, and set ablaze to light evening festivities. Guests walked among the burning bodies as if among lanterns, Rome's justice displayed in fire. Though shocking even to some contemporaries, these punishments reveal how deeply Rome entwined spectacle with power. To betray the empire was not only to be killed, but to become fuel for its display. The flames consumed the traitor's body, but the memory of their betrayal, and its punishment, burned longer in the minds of those who watched. Mock battles of betrayal. Sometimes, Rome staged elaborate executions that mirrored the very act of betrayal itself. In one notorious spectacle, prisoners accused of treachery were forced to reenact battles they had fought against Rome. Dressed in the armor of defeated enemies, they were sent into the arena, where gladiators or Roman soldiers slaughtered them in front of the crowd. These mock battles were not merely punishment, they were propaganda. They retold Rome's victories in living flesh, reinforcing the narrative that betrayal always ended in defeat. The condemned men, once rebels or warriors, became props in Rome's eternal story of triumph. Psychological warfare, fear in the stands. The purpose of these spectacles was not only to destroy the traitors, but to terrify the living. Every Roman citizen, every slave, every provincial who watched these executions understood the lesson. Betrayal was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Fear was the empire's greatest weapon, and the arenas were its forge. By making punishment public, Rome ensured that no betrayal remained hidden. The condemned were exposed, humiliated, and erased in front of thousands. The memory of their deaths traveled beyond the city walls, carried by merchants, travelers, and soldiers, spreading terror across the provinces. The amphitheater thus became both stage and pulpit, preaching Rome's doctrine of obedience. No law, no written decree, no imperial edict carried as much weight as the sight of a traitor torn to pieces before a roaring crowd. The role of the crowd. It is tempting to imagine these spectacles as orchestrated entirely by emperors and officials, but the Roman crowd played a role just as significant. The people demanded blood, and the state supplied it. To betray Rome was to provide a sacrifice to the masses, whose approval and satisfaction were as vital to imperial power as legions or laws. The crowd could be merciless, mocking traitors as they begged for mercy. But sometimes their reaction was more complex. Writers record occasions where the crowd pitied a condemned man or woman, calling for clemency. Rarely were such pleas granted, but they show that the theater of punishment was not only about cruelty. It was about negotiation between rulers and ruled, with betrayal as the currency of fear. The final humiliation, erasure of memory. Even after death, the punishment of traitors continued. Bodies might be left unburied, denied funeral rites, or displayed as warnings. In some cases, names were erased from inscriptions, portraits destroyed, legacies obliterated. This practice, known as damnatio memoriae, was a punishment worse than death for Romans, who believed that memory secured immortality. For traitors, erasure was the ultimate betrayal, by the state against them. To be killed was one thing, but to be forgotten, to have your name struck from history, was to suffer a second death. In this way, Rome did not simply kill its traitors, it annihilated them from the story of the empire itself. Death as entertainment, fear as control. Looking at these spectacles, we might wonder how an empire so advanced in law, engineering, and governance could embrace such cruelty. But for Rome, these were not contradictions. Justice and terror, entertainment and control, were threads woven into the same fabric. The Colosseum and its counterparts were not only theaters of blood, but mirrors of Rome's soul. In the screams of traitors and the roar of beasts, in the fire of burning bodies and the laughter of crowds, Rome revealed the dark logic of its power. Betrayal was not just a crime, it was the stage upon which the empire performed its dominance. And yet, behind the spectacle, there was always the whisper of unease. Some philosophers condemned the games as barbaric, warning that cruelty degraded not only the victims, but the spectators themselves. Others saw in these punishments the seeds of Rome's own downfall, a society so obsessed with punishing betrayal that it betrayed its own humanity. As the blood dried on the sands of the arena, and as the ashes of burned bodies drifted into the night sky, Rome's citizens went home both entertained and warned. Betrayal had been punished. Justice had been served, or so they were told. But the cruelty left its mark, not only on those who died but on the empire itself, which had turned justice into spectacle and fear into governance. Yet Rome's obsession with punishing betrayal did not end in the arenas. It continued in private chambers, imperial palaces, and shadowy conspiracies. For even emperors themselves were not safe. In our final part, we will uncover how betrayal struck at the very heart of power, within the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and even inside the imperial family. For if Rome punished traitors with fire and steel, it was also betrayed by its own blood. If the arenas and roads of Rome displayed the fate of traitors before the people, the palaces and chambers of the imperial city revealed a darker truth. That betrayal was not confined to rebels, slaves, or conquered foes, but ran like poison through the veins of the empire itself. For in Rome, even emperors, the living gods of their age, were haunted by treachery, and many met their deaths not at the hands of foreign enemies, but by conspirators within their own circle. The empire, built on loyalty, discipline, and the punishment of betrayal, was itself betrayed again and again by those sworn to guard it. Senators, generals, guards, even family members, all played their part in a drama where suspicion was constant, and where the punishment for treachery was swift and brutal. From the earliest emperors onward, fear of betrayal was a constant shadow on the throne. Augustus, though shrewd and cautious, knew that his rise to power had been paved with daggers in the Senate. He never forgot how Julius Caesar, his adoptive father, had fallen beneath the blades of men who called themselves liberators. To sit as emperor was to inherit not only a crown, but a curse, the knowledge that betrayal might come from any hand, at any time. As the empire grew, so too did this fear. Emperors surrounded themselves with spies, informants, and secret police. Letters were intercepted, conversations reported, whispers magnified into accusations of treason. In Rome, words could kill as surely as swords. A misplaced comment at a banquet might be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Silence itself could appear suspicious. For emperors, trust became impossible. Friends became potential enemies. Family became rivals. And in this atmosphere of suspicion, betrayal thrived. The Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, became a stage where betrayal was both feared and expected. Many emperors viewed the senators with contempt, seeing them as relics of an older age clinging to faded power. Yet senators still wielded influence, and some sought to reclaim authority by plotting against those they saw as tyrants. Conspiracies flared again and again. Under Tiberius, senators and equestrians were accused of treason in droves, many condemned to death or forced into suicide. Caligula, despised for his cruelty and arrogance, mocked senators openly, pushing them to plot his assassination. Their betrayal was not hidden. It was a performance whispered in corridors, tested with cautious glances, waiting for the right moment. When conspiracies were uncovered, punishment was savage. Noble blood was no protection. Senators could be executed like common criminals, their estates seized, their families shamed. Rome taught its elite the same lesson it taught its slaves. Betrayal would not be forgiven. Yet this very brutality ensured that betrayal never disappeared, only grew more desperate. Nowhere was betrayal more dangerous than in the ranks of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protectors. Created to shield Rome's rulers, they became infamous for turning against them. Armed, disciplined, and stationed within the heart of the city, they were both guardians and executioners holding the fate of emperors in their hands. Caligula discovered this too late. His guards, weary of his humiliations and erratic behavior, turned on him during a palace performance, stabbing him to death before fleeing the scene. Later emperors fared no better. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, names that flickered briefly in the chaos of Rome, year of the 4 emperors, all rose and fell on the blades of their own soldiers. Perhaps the most infamous act of Praetorian betrayal came with the murder of Commodus, the emperor who styled himself a gladiator and fancied he was the new Hercules. Plots against him brewed for years, but it was those closest to him, his mistress, his chamberlain, and eventually his guards, who betrayed him. He was strangled in his bath, a pitiful end for the self-proclaimed conqueror. The Praetorians betrayed emperors for money, for power, for survival. They auctioned the throne itself after murdering Pertinax in 193 CE, offering the empire to the highest bidder. Rome, which had punished traitors with beasts, crosses, and fire, now found itself betrayed by the very men sworn to protect its heart. Yet the cruelest betrayals were often those of blood. Rome's imperial households were torn apart by suspicion, rivalry, and ambition. Fathers turned against sons, brothers against brothers, wives against husbands. The Julio-Claudian dynasty offers endless tales of such treachery. Tiberius, mistrustful of his heirs, withdrew to Capri, where rumors claimed he executed rivals in grotesque ways. Caligula's sisters plotted against him, and he against them, their family bonds drowned in the lust for power. But perhaps the darkest story belongs to Nero. Groomed for rule by his mother Agrippina, he soon turned against her, fearing her influence and ambition. His first attempt to kill her, a collapsing boat designed to sink at sea, failed. She swam to safety, furious and unbroken. Nero then ordered assassins to finish the task, and Agrippina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, was stabbed to death on her own estate. Here was betrayal at its most intimate, a son murdering the mother who had given him the empire. These stories were not unique. From Domitian to Caracalla, imperial families devoured themselves in cycles of suspicion and revenge. To love an emperor was dangerous. To be related to one often fatal. The roll call of betrayed emperors is long and bloody. Out of Rome's many rulers, only a handful died peacefully in their beds. Most were assassinated, poisoned, strangled, stabbed, or abandoned by their guards. Julius Caesar fell beneath 23 daggers in the Senate. Caligula was butchered by his protectors. Galba was cut down in the Forum, his head paraded on a pike. Elagabalus, despised for his excesses, was strangled in a latrine and his body dragged through the streets. Even the great Marcus Aurelius left behind a son, Commodus, whose death by betrayal ended the Antonine dynasty. Each death carried the same message. No one, not even the emperor, was immune to Rome's cycle of treachery and punishment. The empire, which prided itself on crushing betrayal, was itself consumed by it. What then can we make of Rome's obsession with betrayal? To betray Rome was to suffer a fate worse than death, crucifixion, burning, being torn apart by beasts, or the erasure of memory itself. But Rome's rulers, in their fear and cruelty, created a world where betrayal was inevitable. By ruling through terror, they bred conspiracies. By punishing treachery with brutality, they ensured that traitors would strike first, lest they be struck down. In this way, the story of Rome's punishments is also the story of its downfall. The empire that sought to terrify the world with its cruelty became a victim of its own methods. Fear held Rome together, but it also tore Rome apart. As we step back from this dark journey, we see Rome not only as a city of marble, law, and conquest, but as a place haunted by betrayal. The roads lined with crucified rebels, the arenas echoing with screams, the palaces soaked in blood. All remind us that the empire's greatness was shadowed by cruelty. Rome punished its traitors with fire, iron, and spectacle, but in the end it too was betrayed. By its own soldiers, senators, and emperors. The lesson of Rome is as chilling now as it was then. Power built on fear is never safe, and those who rule by terror may find themselves devoured by the same darkness they unleash. This is the legacy of Rome's punishments, a history not only of law and order, but of blood and betrayal.